You're listening to Cornerstone West Los Angeles.
Good morning, everybody. We have come to the end of the book of Ecclesiastes. If you've been with us, we've been working through this sort of extremely realistic, often challenging, and surprisingly joyful book in the very middle of your Bible. All of those things we hear again as we come to the very last section of the book. And so we'll read it. Ecclesiastes chapter 11, verse 9 through the end of the book. Chapter 12, verse 14. It's on page 559 of your pew Bibles. It's also up on the screen. Here's what it has to say. Rejoice, O young man, in your youth, and let your heart cheer you in the days of your youth. Walk in the ways of your heart and the sight of your eyes, but know that for all these things God will bring you into judgment. Remove vexation from your heart and put away pain from your body, for youth and the dawn of life are vanity. Remember also your Creator in the days of your youth, before the evil days come and the years draw near of which you will say, I have no pleasure in them. Before the sun and the light and the moon and the stars are darkened and the clouds return after the rain, in the day when the keepers of the house tremble and the strong men are bent and the grinders cease because they are few, and those who look through the windows are dimmed and the doors on the street are shut, when the sound of the grinding is low, and one rises up at the sound of a bird, and all the daughters of song are brought low. They are afraid also of what is high, and terrors are in the way. The almond tree blossoms, the grasshopper drags itself along, and desire fails, because man is going to his eternal home, and the mourners go about the streets. Before the silver cord is snapped, or the golden bowl is broken, or the pitcher is shattered at the fountain, or the wheel broken at the cistern, and the dust returns to the earth as it was, and the spirit returns to God who gave it. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher, all is vanity. Besides being wise, the preacher also taught the people knowledge, weighing and studying and arranging many proverbs with great care. The preacher sought to find words of delight, and uprightly he wrote words of truth. The words of the wise are like goads, and like nails firmly fixed are the collected sayings. They are given by one shepherd. My son, beware of anything beyond these. Of making many books there is no end, and much study is a weariness of the flesh. The end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil. This is the word of the Lord. Preaching class, they teach you about what they call landing the plane. It's obviously a metaphor, but the flight only really works no matter how much lack of turbulence there is. It only really works if it lands well, and the people are able then to sort of disembark and go live their life in this new place that you've brought them to. And so in any sermon, the idea was you have to sort of land the plane. You have to summarize, and then you have to try and get that idea across in a way that lets people go and live it out in their life and carry it with them. And this, at the end of Ecclesiastes, is the preacher landing the plane. It's how the plane lands for the whole book. The first half is basically summary, what he said so far in this beautiful poem. And then there's last words, parting words that help you understand how to take these ideas into your life. Now, for at least some of you, if not most of you, the feedback I've gotten is that this has been a relatively powerful book to go through. And so this then is the message that shows us how to carry it with you, how to take it into your life, how to go live in this new place that Ecclesiastes has delivered you to. And so that's what we'll do. We'll have a couple of points this morning. We're going to talk about the summary, that first half of the passage, which essentially is boiled down to remember and rejoice. And then we'll talk about the last word, the final word, which boils down to fear God in all of its joy and challenge. And so first, the summary, remember and rejoice. The book thus far has been about how we play pretend. The idea is that we don't really want to square up to the realities of life because they're challenging. They remind us of how small we are. They remind us of how little we control. And so we spend most of our life playing pretend that we're in control. So we say that we pretend that if we work hard enough and make the right decisions, things will go well for us. We pretend that if we are good people, then good things will happen in our life. We pretend that if we do wise things with our money, we will have our money for the rest of our life. We pretend that if we raise our kids a certain way, that those kids will turn out exactly the way we want them to turn out. We pretend that if we live a certain way or eat a certain way or act a certain way, we will get the results we want out of our life. We pretend that we have some ability to shape our life into the image we want it to take. And the preacher, thus far in this book, that's what he calls himself, the author of the book, he's refused to let us play pretend about our abilities to control life. He won't, in other words, let us lie to ourselves. And so he's forced us to see what he said over and over again, that life is vanity. And that word we've said, it means vapor. It means, think smoke. And so life is like smoke. Your life is like smoke. When you try and move it, it defies you by curling back around your hand, as though to say, you can't do that. That's not how I work. When you try and shape it, it won't do what you want it to do. And it's fleeting. It's there, and it's beautiful, and it's complex, and it swirls in ways you can't anticipate or predict, and then it's just sort of gone. He says life is like that. Vanity of vanities. All is vanity. And he finishes this whole book showing us those same truths, those same realities in a relatively new way. It's in a poem. Now, he's done poetry a couple of times before, but not quite like this. At the end of the book, what he wants to do is give us a poem that allows us to inhabit some of these realities. That's how poems work. Poems describe experiences in a way that statements can't. Poems allow you to feel certain things as though you were living them, instead of just sort of describing them from the outside in a detached kind of a way. And that's what he's doing here. He wants to get you and me in a position where we see the realities of life, especially death, sort of the ultimate reality that comes for us, from the inside. And not just death all at once at the end, but how death takes things from us slowly over time. And so you have this very long poem in the very middle of what we read. And it's sort of images stacked on images about the experience of death, both through age and loss, and eventually as it finally comes. Now, it's tempting then to sort of take it and think, remember like cereal boxes where you had the magic decoder ring in the bottom, to sort of pull out the decoder ring and say, I'm going to decode this whole poem and get at what's behind every little phrase and sentence. That's not quite how poetry works. It's not there as sort of a barrier between you and what it's trying to say. It's there for you to inhabit. At the same time, it is trying to express things about death in these certain metaphorical, imagery-driven ways. And so if you look through the poem, you try and put that on, and you see, it begins in verse 2 of chapter 12 with this sort of light imagery. The lights begin to fade. You can't see as well. Things obscure the sun. Things obscure the moon. And then there's this household imagery. It's almost like your body is like a house with all these moving parts inside of it that slowly begin to stop working. Things get harder. The strong men begin to fail. Think, muscles, legs, things like that. They get weaker. There's grinders, sort of maybe like your teeth, that get, there's fewer of them, and they don't work as well. They slow down. You find this idea of those who look through windows, think eyes, that begin to get dimmer and dimmer and dimmer, as though there's an image of everything sort of settling down for the night, and lights being switched off one after the other after the other. And then he heaps up, it's almost like a snowball that gets bigger and crazier as it goes. He heaps up all of these other images together towards the middle. In the end, there's this degeneration of aging and death, and you get these things about almond tree blossoms and the idea of grayness. Almond trees blossomed gray. You get this grasshopper dragging itself along because it ate too much and it can't digest. You get desire failing. You get ideas of being scared at things that aren't there and not being able to hear things that are there. And then finally, in verse 6 and 7 and 8, you find just the beauty and the value of human life as it ends. And so you have, the thing that connects body and soul is a silver string. It's not twine, but it's cut. It's a golden bowl, but it's broken. And then finally, you get this sort of collective decreation that ties all the way back to the beginning of the Bible. The dust returns to the earth. The spirit returns to God who gave it. And the point is, that as you try and inhabit this and try and experience it, that this is how it ends for everyone. This is the summary. We are not big enough to control it. And he says, vanity of vanities, all is vanity, it's all vapor. There's no amount of knowledge or pleasure or family or power or wisdom that will get you control over your life, that will get you to negotiate with this reality. You will die. And you will lose plenty of things along the way. And yet, like the rest of the book, this whole thing is set in this context. It's paired with the idea that despite all of this, or in light of all this, joy is readily accessible. Not pretend joy, not insincere joy, not superficial joy that hides from the realities of life. Actual, sincere, genuine joy in light of this happening to you. And you see it at the beginning of the section. He sets the poem in the context of two commands. Remember and rejoice. The first few verses at the end of chapter 11 are about rejoicing, and then right before the poem, you get this idea of remember your Creator. And these are the two commands. Remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before this begins to happen. Now, what he's saying there is this. When you're young, it's easy to play pretend. I have young kids in my house, and one of the fascinating things about them to me is that they have the ability, like when they get a cut, they need a Band-Aid, and they need ice, and they think their arm is going to fall off. And so you have to sort of amass all of these first aid elements for them, and then you put the Band-Aid on, and in about 20 seconds, they're ready to go back and play, because they're fine now. And the next day, you take the Band-Aid off, and it's like the cut's gone. When I get a cut, I have it for like a month. When you're young, you recover in these fascinating ways. And there's a way that, in that sense, when you're young, life, there's always something ahead of you. There's always something that comes next. There's always this amazing ability to say, this too shall pass. And that's also true of sort of a more metaphorical sense of youth. When things are going well, when you feel like whatever's going on isn't going to last forever. There's a way that, for young people, or people who, when things are going well, when all of your ducks are in a row, when everything feels like it's going to heal, when everything feels like it's going to be fine, it's easy to pretend that you created all of that. And if you created all of that, then that means that you can keep things going well for the rest of your life. It's easy to play pretend when you're young. It's easy to play pretend when things are going well. And yet, it's the realities of life, the preacher says. The realities of loss, the realities of death, the realities of injustice, these sorts of things, they force you to recognize that you are playing pretend. You aren't actually in control of these things. And because they do, they force you then to remember that God's the one who's God. God's the one who's in control, not you. God's the one who heals, not you. God's the one who provides, not you. Now, that has a major implication. And that's this. It's not just that God is in control while you're not. That's true, and he hits that very, very hard. But he hits that because of something larger. If God is in control and you're not, that means that everything you have is something that you did not secure for yourself. Everything you have is not something that you earned and therefore had coming to you. If God is in control and you're not, then everything you have is a gift from God. He's a creator in which you did not create all the things you have in your life. He did. And therefore, when you face up to the realities of life, he says, you have to remember your Creator. You have to remember, therefore, that he is the one who gave you all the good gifts you have in your life. We're coming off Thanksgiving, which is the holiday where two things happen simultaneously. One, just about everyone stops and realizes they have some things that they can't quite trace back to their good thinking or hard work ethic. And so, but it's, it's like, well, I have things to be thankful for. And it's somewhat superficial sometimes. Sometimes it's deep, but it's almost a hashtag blessed sort of thing. It's like, look at all this. This is great. Thanksgiving. Let's go around the table. Think of all the great things. At the same time, Thanksgiving is also this way that we find ourselves being superficial in our thanks. Where you start listening through things and you go, yeah, but a lot of this is stuff that I did. And so you find this really odd thing where you're trying to give thanks for something without having a subject to give thanks to. So the weird part about giving thanks is that you always thank someone for something. It's very difficult to say, I'm very thankful for all this stuff that I provided for myself. And yet that's what tends to happen. It's so great that this all worked out as I planned it. It's so wonderful that I made good decisions and worked hard and have these things. And so you go around the table sometimes, at Thanksgiving dinner, and you find we all are very thankful for all the things that we've done. Now, when you face up to the realities of life, you stop doing that. In other words, when you remember your Creator, that necessarily results in you looking at all of your life as a gift, looking at all the things you have as gifts you did not earn and didn't have coming for you. And when everything is, by the way, that's how you know. What he's saying, it's very stark. The way you know if you have actually faced up to the realities of life is if you see everything as a gift. And there are plenty of ways that we stop short of that and then congratulate ourselves because we think we've faced up to the realities of life. You can become a cynic. Somebody says, well, I saw the realities of life and I realized things aren't as great as they seem. And I know that. And I'm not going to get sort of hoodwinked by all this other Hallmark holiday stuff out there. I get how bad life is. Or you can become a hedonist. Become someone who says, really, I get that life is sort of meaningless, and so I'm just going to get mine while I can. Whatever that looks like for you, whether it's very, very wrapped up and nice and neat and proper, or very crazy. Whatever it is, that's what you're going to do. Or you can be an escapist. The kind of person that says, I saw the realities of life, and I realized I better get religious so I won't have any problems again. I won't have to deal with the realities of life ever again. There's all these different ways you can do it, but what's fascinating is all of those ways, you pat yourself on the back saying, you see, I know about the realities of life, but you only ever saw them halfway. All of those realities, some of us are in here, you took a glance at the realities of life, and then you ran and hunkered down under some defense mechanism that made yourself feel good about things. I'm a cynic, I get it. I'm going to get some good experiences while I can. Oh, I got religious, I don't have to deal with that anymore. You're just running. You're just hiding. The cynic sees that we're not in control, but then still thinks he deserves all the things he has. There's a deep inconsistency in that. If you really understood the realities of life, that you really aren't in control of these things, you would see that everything you have is not the result of your choices. These are all gifts. The hedonist sees we're not in control, but still thinks that you can sort of navigate pleasure and experience enough to grab some meaning out of it. But if you're not in control, then you can't navigate that well. The escapist thinks they've seen the realities of life and then thinks that they can hide somehow in a pew, and therefore reality goes away. But if you aren't in control, then you can't hide that well. See, all of these ideas are only halfway facing up to the fact that you aren't in control of your life. If you really faced up to it, the only conclusion is that I'm so not in control that everything I have is a gift. And so if you really have faced up to the realities of life, not just tried to do it halfway and then pat yourself on the back and be self-congratulatory, then we would have much more authentic Thanksgiving meals on a daily basis. Because we would see that we really aren't in control, and therefore everything is a gift. Remember your Creator, the Creator of the good things in your youth. That's remember. Then he says rejoice. Now, when everything's a gift, see, now you understand this. When everything's a gift, you remember your Creator, then you find yourself rejoicing in a new way. He says rejoice in your youth. In other words, this is the end of chapter 11, verses 9 and 10. He says, in other words, as long as there's gifts to enjoy them. And he talks about, do this in your youth. Remove vexation from your heart. Put away pain from your body. The idea is enjoy the life you've been given, especially the youth that you have left. And so this isn't just for young people. It's for all of us who are not as old as we will be tomorrow. If you will be older tomorrow, you are younger today. And that means that you really ought to enjoy what you've been given in your youth. The preacher throughout the book has been telling us, rejoice, enjoy the gifts of God. But just don't do it as a way of hiding from the realities of life. Don't try and enjoy these things as this sort of defense mechanism against what life is really like and the control you don't have. No, do it as a way of embracing the gifts that you've been given. And that's how these things swirl together. When you remember your Creator, it leads to rejoicing. When you remember that God is the giver of all the good things, then it leads to seeing all of life as a gift. And if you don't remember your Creator in the days of your youth, then all of the rest of your life will turn into loss, where you have no sense of the gifts you have. Someone sent me this video this week. I think it's a church video, a church drama video, no less, that's gone viral, and for a good reason, which I've never seen that happen before. Apparently it's popular, so maybe you've seen it. This will be the first time I've known about something popular. But it's sort of a shot of this suburban house, typical house, and shot of it's a guy and his wife and their 2.5 kids. Just the very, as stereotypical as it gets. And then they pan into the bedroom, and this guy sort of sits up, but he's covered in wrapping paper. And he tears out his face, and he goes, "I'm alive!" And he leans over, and his wife is covered in wrapping paper, so he tears it off and says, "You're here too!" And he starts running around, and they unwrap their kids, and he goes into the bathroom, and the faucet's all wrapped up, and he takes it off and goes, "We have fresh water. It's piped right here." I mean, the whole thing. Breakfast is sort of in the pan. It's all wrapped up. He pokes a hole in it. It goes, "Bacon!" And his car is wrapped up. His coffee is wrapped up. He pokes a hole in it to take a drink. Everything is a gift. And so the idea, obviously, it's for some Christmas series the church is doing. The idea is, we should see all the gifts that God's given us. What fascinated me about this whole thing was the shots near the beginning and the lifestyle that was set up. Because this suburban house and this life stage and this guy going off to work with his breakfast and his coffee and saying goodbye, this has been the setup for hundreds of movies about midlife crises, about the angst of being trapped inside of the rat race you can't get out of, about looking around at everything around you and saying, "I can't leave this. I get up next to the same person. I drink the same cup of coffee. I go to work at the same place. I come home to the same house, and then I do the whole thing over again. I feel trapped." It was fascinating to me to see that what most of the time we look at as being trapped, doing the same thing over and over again, this guy and this perspective allows you to see as a gift. See, the same thing here is what the preacher is trying to get across in this book of Ecclesiastes. If you do not remember your Creator in the days of your youth, if you don't remember that He's the one who gives you all the good things in your life, then what that means is you will miss all the gifts in your life and you will feel trapped. And what that means is that as this poem becomes true in your life, everything that gets taken from you is just lost that you'll never get back. But what's fascinating is if you remember your Creator in the days of your youth, then you understand that everything you have is a gift. And so even as certain parts of your life become more difficult, even as your vision blurs and you need glasses, your hearing goes, you need someone to speak up, you can't chew as well as you used to, even as all these things happen, you don't heal as fast as you used to heal. Even as all of this happens, every day you still find yourself waking up and unwrapping everything in your life. Remember your Creator in the days of your youth and rejoice. See, that's the application here. That was the summary. That's the whole book. Are you awake to the realities of life? Are you awake enough that they have driven you not to these halfway pit stops of self-congratulation like cynicism or hedonism or escapism? Are you awake enough that they've driven you to realize you really aren't in control of this stuff? And therefore, everything in your life really is a gift. Are you awake enough to that you now remember your Creator, which is more than intellectual. It's a calling to mind, a drawing of that reality into your life, and rejoicing in a way that's more than emotional, more than just a mood you happen to be in, but something that is a lens through which you view all the things in your life. Are you awake enough to the realities of life that you unwrap the things in your life on a daily basis? Or are you not remembering your Creator? Are you not rejoicing in such a way that you find yourself trapped, not unwrapping? Going through the motions, not rejoicing. And so that's what we have to do. He tells you have to do, these are commands. You must remember. You must rejoice. You have to remember that you have to call these things to mind. You have to go to church and read your Bibles and pray honest and sincere prayers and face up to the realities of life and turn to God with them with both eyes open. And you must rejoice. You have to put on glasses, the new kind of lenses that allow you to see the wrapping paper around all the amazing gifts that God has given you. You have to. It's the only way to really live as a human being in light of what life is really like. Awake to the realities of life, remembering your Creator and rejoicing in what He's given you. That's the summary. That's been the whole book. And then we have the last words. Now, in verse 9, things change. You'll notice, all of a sudden everything's kind of in the third person. What a lot of people think is that this is the actual sort of person who wrote down the book. The preacher had a deep relationship with this person, or his thoughts were known to this person. And so what happened is this guy wrote them all down, and then this is his sort of, his last word. So imagine, for example, like a grown grandchild listening to his grandfather. He writes down what he says over years. He ponders over it. They spend time together, on the porch, listening to all that he has to say, all the stories of his life. And then, you ask him a few years later, what did your grandfather teach you? And so what's the guy going to say? The grandchild's going to say, well, let me tell you some of the things he said, and let me read you some of the stories he told me, and let me tell you about what happened in his life. And then at the end, he's going to sort of sum up and say, and here's what I took from it. Here's what you should take from his life and his experience. And that's what this is. And so in verse 9, it says, besides being wise, the preacher also taught the people knowledge, weighing and studying and arranging many proverbs with great care. The preacher sought to find words of delight, and uprightly he wrote words of truth. So he's saying everything he did, all the things we've just gone through, the point of these words was to be delightful and true, was for them to sort of set your heart at rest in delight, because you've seen the truth and you found joy in it, delightful and true. But then he says they're also meant to be challenging. He says in verse 11, the words of the wise are like goads. Goads were these things that like a shepherd would use with sheep, where they were kind of sharp, and you'd poke, if the sheep is going to go wander off a cliff, you poke the sheep to keep it alive and get it back on the path it's supposed to be on, towards life and flourishing and thriving. That's what you use a goad for. You poke it, and it hurts, but it hurts for a purpose. And he says these are like nails firmly fixed, these collected sayings. They're given by one shepherd. What he's saying is that God is the ultimate source of these things. There's one shepherd, and he uses these delightful and true words. Even though they're delightful and true, he uses them to poke you, to prod you. They're challenging words. They confront you in ways you don't always want to be confronted. And because they're challenging, he says, there's this common thing we do to try and make an end run around them. We sort of try and see if there's other knowledge out there that can help us avoid these conclusions. Or just study so long we never actually have to conclude. There's always one more thing to read. And that's why he says in verse 12, my son, beware of anything beyond these, of making many books there is no end, and much study is a weariness of the flesh. Now the point isn't that we shouldn't learn more. I mean, the word disciple basically means learner. So if you're a disciple of Jesus Christ, you're someone who should always be learning. And the people who preach here, myself included, we use books to learn stuff, to preach. And so this is an anti-study sort of thing. The point is that if you try and get to different conclusions than these, because you're always saying, well, there might be one thing someone thought in some book that I haven't heard that one yet, so I'm just going to sort of reserve concluding. Or, I'm just going to keep going to try and find some way around the realities that's been talked about in this book. He says, all you're going to end up with is weariness. If you don't like being goaded by this, there's a way of trying avoiding it by just constant studying and constant learning and constant pretending like there's more things out there that once I know that, then I can really conclude. He says, no. That's just going to leave you tired. You're just going to be tired. There's always one more book. But these sayings are like nails. They're firmly fixed. They'll hold you up, in other words. And so what's the point then, he says? So what is the takeaway? What is the thing that you can try and avoid in the midst of all this? He says, the end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil. What's the takeaway? Fear God because judgment is coming. Now, that can seem like an equally odd and foreboding kind of end to a book about remembering and rejoicing and all these gifts. But if you've been following through, you understand this ties into everything else he's been saying. Because along the way, what's he brought up? Over and over again, the vanity of life, the injustice of these things under the sun, the injustice of death, if you remember, was tied to the fact that good people and evil people, someone who has spent their life sacrificing for others, and someone who has spent their life oppressing and being selfish with others and taking from them. The end of the story for both of them is that they die. There's an injustice to that, he said. How come they both have the same ending to the story? And the vanity of life in terms of meaning, in terms of, how you live, that was tied to this sort of thing as well, to the equalizer of death. The fact that you can't take anything with you, the fact that your knowledge and your riches and your work ethic, they still leave you dead at the end. And if you leave a legacy, it just dies a few years after you. There's a frustration to that. There's a vanity to that. And the preacher says, the only hope for meaning under the sun, the only hope for stability in an unstable world under the sun, is if there's judgment over the sun. There is a resolution to all this, he says. And the only way that exists is if there's some kind of judgment after this. And he says that's what does happen. God will bring every deed into judgment, every secret thing, meaning that even if someone got away with everything in this life, they don't get away with everything in the next. Things will be shown for what they really are. A world of confusion gets brought into clarity. And so there's something after this that stabilizes everything that's unstable now. That's what he's saying. Judgment is the grand resolution to life under the sun. And so the book ends, in light of judgment, fear God, obey God. If God is the one with whom judgment rests, if he's the one with true power, if he's the one who stands over all this and will bring it into order, then the only way to live is to build your life around him, is to orchestrate your life and organize your life around what he has asked you to do. And that's the idea of the word fear, this idea of orchestrating, of centering your life on God, which is easily lost today because today we think of fear as always bad. Fear for us only means one very narrow thing. To fear something is to think it's out to hurt you, and therefore to take steps to protect yourself against that thing. But that's not the only kind of fear. The Bible has a larger understanding of fear that we should probably adopt. My son, who's now 6, when he was like 2 or 3, the two of us are the only males in the family, and so I don't know if that led to this particular situation we found ourselves in a lot, but he always wanted to wrestle. Maybe because I kept telling him to not hurt his sisters. But, we're on the bed, and I'm throwing him around, and he just loved it, and he wanted to tear my head off. And, so here we're doing all this stuff. It was his love language. But the thing is, when you're doing this and you're throwing him around, I'm always essentially playing at a 3 to 5-year-old level, right? I'm not wrestling him as a full-grown man. I'm wrestling, that's not what I'm doing. But there would be times, for example, this thing he loved to do all the time, which is say, watch me, and see how fast I can go, and look to see if you're watching while he's running right at a wall. All the time. And what I would have, so there are moments when I'm not close enough, and he was going pretty fast. A 3-year-old can get up to a pretty good speed, and his head's facing forward. It's not going to end well, and we had enough visits to the ER already. So I would get over there, and I would grab him, and at this point, I'm not acting like a 3-year-old, I'm acting like a full-grown man, and you don't have time to massage this, so I would grab him, and I would get him up in the air. And the look on his face, now, almost all the time I'm playing on his level, but in those moments, I'm using a power of a whole different magnitude that he does not usually see from me. And from his perspective, you could see it, there was a fear. We call it being startled, but it's more than that, and it's more than that. There's a sense of I didn't realize Dad was this big. And I didn't realize I was this small, and maybe I can't take him in wrestling the way I thought I could. He doesn't normally experience that kind of power, and it frankly is frightening. That's fear. He's literally trembling. But what's funny is he didn't hit the wall. The thing that was really going to hurt him didn't happen. It was me saving him that made him tremble. And in that same, he knows at some level, he knows it's harder to do now that he's 6 and now that I'm older, but he knows that I exercise that power. I always uniquely exercise that level of power at that order of magnitude because I love him, not because I don't. Always. Ecclesiastes has taught us that's what God is like. We are not bigger than him. We are smaller than we think. And there are times when he uses his power and it is jarring. And when you see that he has power like that he alone is above the sun, you realize nothing else has power like that. And we also see that God is the giver of good gifts. He's the creator you're to remember. God always exercises his power because he loves us, not because he doesn't. And in that way, Ecclesiastes, the whole book, the whole time, has pointed us forward to the one true good shepherd who would use that power, take that level, that order of magnitude of power, and use it to lay his life down for his sheep. This is how you know that he is bigger than you, but he will only exercise that power because he loves you. See, that's the problem with judgment, is it never just applies to everyone else. It's very inconvenient that way. Every secret thing that gets brought into judgment includes all the things in us. That's how justice works. In order for justice to work, it has to be universal. That's why, justice is blind. Not because it's dumb, but because it can't start looking around and being partial. And so for God's judgment to bring any kind of meaning, for it to exist in any substantive sense, it has to apply to everyone. There's a theologian, Miroslav Volf, which is a very fun name to say. And Miroslav, he wrote lots of books, and he's from Yugoslavia, and he wrote at one point about, in one of his books, about how he really struggled with the idea of God and judgment. And he said, things began to unwrap for me when I lived through a war in Yugoslavia. He said, I lived through it from a distance, but these were towns that were being bombed that I had been in. These are people who were being maimed and disfigured that could have been my family. It was a very, very difficult thing. And I began to understand, he said, that having a problem with judgment, with God's judgment, is the kind of thing that only really happens in first world comfortable places. When I left my first world comfortable place and found myself in a different place, even though it was from a distance, I realized that everyone else understands very much God's judgment. And he said, but immediately there was a problem. He said, because I realized I cannot control where that judgment is aimed. If it's going to address evil, any kind of evil in others, it has to address the evil in me too. And he said, right there, he says, my pretenses fell apart. Because I thought that I was a relatively good person while other people who were bad, they were relatively bad people. I thought that's how the universe stacked up. He says, but I knew that at that point, God's judgment, if it existed at all, would have to know and deal with every secret thing, even mine. You can't control where it's aimed. If it exists, it's aimed at me as much as it is at you. And Ecclesiastes has taught us we're not big enough to control our lives, so we are definitely not big enough to control God's judgment. We are definitely not big enough to manage it, to negotiate with it, to out-argue it. And the gospel shows us the way that gets handled is that the giver of good gifts takes that judgment for us. That's the way it gets handled. And that leads to the good kind of fear, the kind of fear a small child has of a good father. Or the thing you're afraid of is what happened as you were saved. You see, in Psalm 130, it says, if you, O Lord, should mark iniquities, O Lord, who could stand? Who can aim your judgment? Who's the one that's not going to have a secret thing? But with you, there is forgiveness that you may be feared. That's the message of Ecclesiastes. We called the series Being Human. And after it says, fear God and obey his commandments, it says that's the whole duty of man. But what's interesting is the actual words underneath the text are just, that's the whole of man. Now, duty is a good translation, don't get me wrong. It's very tied to that. But there's a sense in which it wants to broaden out and not just be, this is the duty of man, like, well, here's your job description as a human being. It wants to say, this is what you are. This is what you're created to be. Being human means living as someone both very small and very safe, because there's a God over the sun. So safe that you can embrace being small because you saw what he did with his power, that order of magnitude of power, by laying his own life down on the cross. And so he says, when you see that, when you see Jesus bring you to good fear that allows you to remember your creator, your sustainer, your redeemer, your God, then you fear him. You build your life around him. You organize your life around his will. You orchestrate your decisions around his commandments, his size and his goodness, which means that God then, for you, becomes so weighty, that power becomes so universal, and your focal point of your existence is so tightly beaded on him that then anything he says and everything he says from above the sun displaces anything and everything else, even your own desires and your own opinions and your own emotions. Everything gets displaced. Your whole life is built around him, because how else could it be if he exists and he's that powerful and that good? But then it opens up the door to something else. Oswald Chambers said, the remarkable thing about fearing God is that when you fear God, you fear nothing else. Whereas if you don't fear God, you fear everything else. And isn't that what we learned in Ecclesiastes? Fearing other things. In other words, building your life around experiences, or around leaving a legacy, or around changing the world, or around having the right kind of family, or around being successful, or around knowing enough, or around knowing enough to know you don't know enough, or around all these sorts of things. All these ways of controlling your life, you build your life around them. They simply lead to meaninglessness and self-destruction and chasing after the wind. And so your life is, and some of us are in here, you're tired. And you're tired because you're trying to grab something you can't hold on to. You're chasing after the wind. You just a little further, and it'll all unlock for you. And then a little further after that, and a little further after that, you see, you're fearing everything else. But when you fear God, all those other things, they lose their hold on you. You know, your money, your success, your career, your family, your social standing, your knowledge base, how wise you are, how funny you are, whatever else you got. All those things, they stop being ways you try and achieve your own little mini godhood. They stop being things you try and squeeze heaven out of. And they start being just gifts you can enjoy and rejoice in and not have to worship. Do you fear God in that way? Has the grace of God, the goodness of the God who gives in Jesus Christ, created that kind of fear in you, where because of him you've lost fear of anything else? And when those fears grab onto you, you're quick to disentangle them, because you know who you must fear. You know who has real power, and you know who really loves you. That's what it means to be human. To remember and rejoice and live small. G.K. Chesterton is a Christian that wrote a bunch of books. That's his bio. It's the worst introduction ever. He wrote this series of short little stories and essays called Tremendous Trifles. He liked being clever. And the very first one was about these two little boys, Peter and Paul. I'm sure there's allegory there. I don't know what it is. And they run out the front door to play. And they meet a fairy. He's British, so that means genie. That's fairies were genies in Britain, apparently. And so this fairy says, you know, I grant you each one wish. What do you want? And Peter says, I want to be huge. Like, I want to be able to walk across the earth, you know, in 30 steps. So genie says, okay, fair enough. And up he goes, and he's huge. And it tells the story of Peter. It says he walked over to see, you know, the pyramids. He went to all the 7 wonders of the world, and he walks over and he says, these look like little dice. They're so small. These are boring. And he goes over to the Babylon gardens, the Hanging Gardens, and says, these are the weeds. You know, he walks around, and finally he gets so bored he just lays down, and he ends up getting killed by some tribe. I'm not sure what that part was about, but it didn't end well for Peter. He goes to Paul, you know. This fairy says, what do you want to be? And he says, I want to be small. And so he gets shrunk down. And he's in this, you know, the garden, the front yard, by the picket fence and all these things. He gets shrunk down. And the story ends with little Paul, who's the Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, this tiny little, and he says he turned around and he saw this little piece of dew that he completely ignored before is this giant orb refracting all of this light. It's just amazing. And he said, he set his face towards the horizon and began his journey to the front door. The book of Ecclesiastes comes to you, and the Bible comes to you and says, Jesus is the one who can make you gloriously small. If you are trying to be big, if you're trying to be self-congratulatory, if you're trying to control your life, you will end up bored and big and dead. But if Jesus comes into your life, he can make you gloriously small. And you will be small and excited, and you will still die. But what will happen is this life will become an adventure at unwrapping things every day over and over. You'll set out on an adventure to the horizon of the end of your front door, and then to the horizon of your office or your kid's school or your own school. You'll set off on these adventures every day. You'll be very, very small and very well taken care of, and you will still die, and then you will see that God's judgment has been completely taken care of for you, and there's a greater adventure that awaits you. And I think that at least one piece of heaven will be us continually getting smaller, seeing more, appreciating more, finding Ecclesiastes taking more root in our life. So you want to take this book away with you? You want to carry it with you? You remember your Creator. You rejoice in the good gifts. You unwrap things every day. You call it to mind. You pray. You read your Bible. You go to church. You bring these things to your mind. And you fear God. And let Him make you small where you used to want to be big, so that your whole life becomes an adventure and we await a whole other one. We should take it with us. We should fear our God. Okay, let's pray.
Thank you for listening to Cornerstone West Los Angeles. For more information, please visit us on the web at cornerstonewla.org.